Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping into one of the most important peace treaties of the 20th century and digging into its absolutely massive and, kind of surprising economic legacy. So, let's start with just one number, 82%. Keep that in your head because it's not just a statistic, it's a story. A story about the real, measurable value of peace. And that brings us to our big question. How in the world did a single peace treaty manage to grow Egypt's per capita income by 82%? We're going to unpack how the Camp David Accords, this incredibly high-stakes diplomatic gamble back in 1978, did way more than just end a war. But, to really get how big of a deal this peace dividend was, we have to go back. We need to understand the decades of brutal war that came before it, which made peace feel, well, almost impossible. For 30 long years, Egypt and Israel were just locked in this vicious cycle, one war after another. The sources are really clear on this, saying each war basically planted the seeds for the next one. It was a seemingly endless, destructive loop. And the cost of being in this constant state of war? It was staggering. We're talking about economies that were going nowhere, growing anger and unrest at home, and just this huge, huge drain on their national budgets. The pressure was so intense that peace honestly felt like a luxury that neither country could even afford to think about. And that brings us to this absolutely audacious gamble. To try and break this stalemate, U.S. President Jimmy Carter came up with a pretty radical idea. Lock everyone away for a 13-day summit in complete isolation. Carter was hoping, that this secluded environment would help build some trust, but boy, was he wrong. The sources tell us that the intense, claustrophobic vibe of Camp David just made the hostility between Egypt's Anwar Sadat and Israel's Menahem Begin even worse. As one person put it, they were trapped. Neither one could leave without it looking like a total political disaster. Now here's where it gets really interesting. Sadat wasn't just there to make peace. He was playing a bigger game. His goal was to replace Israel as America's main ally in the region. He figured even if the talks failed, as long as it looked like it was Israel's fault, Egypt would still come out on top in Washington. And then you've got Begin on the other side. He showed up thinking this would be a quick 2 or 3 day thing. According to the sources, his number one goal was just to not get blamed for the failure he thought was coming. And the great irony, of course, is that the only way for him to avoid the blame was to actually let the summit succeed. So you can imagine, President Carter had to completely change his game plan. He started out as a facilitator, just hoping to nudge them toward common ground. But the hostility got so bad, he had to become more of a referee, literally keeping them apart. And finally, he realized the only way this was going to work was if he became the deal maker, a full aggressive partner, using all the power of the U.S. to push them toward a deal they would never reach on their own. So how did this all shake out? Well, what came out of those 13 days was absolutely historic, but it was also a masterclass in tricky diplomacy built on very careful wording and some pretty big omissions. The secret ingredient was this idea called constructive ambiguity. Basically, it means using vague but very carefully chosen words so that both sides can sign the same piece of paper while believing it means different things. It was the key to getting a deal done, but this clever diplomatic trick came at a really high price for the Palestinians. And here's the final bargain laid out. For Egypt and Israel, the wins were real and concrete. Israel would completely pull out of the Sinai Peninsula, Egypt would get its valuable oil fields back, and they'd have formal diplomatic relations. But for the Palestinians, the language was fuzzy on purpose, promises of full autonomy and legitimate rights, while specifically avoiding the phrase self-determination. This quote from Yasser Arafat, the head of the PLO, just perfectly captures the reaction. The Palestinian leadership saw the accords as a massive betrayal. By signing this deal, Egypt had basically cut itself off from the wider Arab cause to look after its own national interests. Which brings us right back to our big question. How did this messy, controversial, and, let's be honest, flawed agreement lead to that incredible 82% growth in income? Okay, let's dive into the data. So how can we be sure the peace treaty is what actually caused all this growth? Well, economists use this really clever tool called the synthetic control method. It's kind of like they created a ghost Egypt in their data, a statistical model made up of a mix of similar countries that didn't make peace. By comparing the real Egypt to this ghost Egypt, they could isolate the exact economic impact of the treaty. Pretty cool, right? So, where did the money come from? Well, the first big dividend was fiscal. It was simple. After 1978, Egypt could finally slash its military budget. Research shows it dropped by an average of 3 percentage points of GDP. That is a ton of money that was suddenly free to be used for other things. But that's only half the story. The second piece was all about investment. The peace treaty sent a huge signal to the world. Economists call it a credibility shock. All of a sudden, the political risk of investing in Egypt just plummeted, and foreign money came pouring in, rising by almost 2 percentage points of GDP. And here's the bottom line. You take the money saved from the military, you add in all that new foreign investment, and boom, you get this incredible economic payoff. Compared to that ghost country that never had peace, the real Egypt's GDP grew 64% larger, and its income per person shot up by 82%. This wasn't a temporary blip. It was a permanent change to its entire economic future. So what can we learn from all this today? The Camp David Accords give us a really powerful blueprint, but it turns out it's not the only way a peace dividend can work. Let's compare the Camp David model to the more recent Abraham Accords. See, Camp David ended a direct 30-year hot war, so its main payoff came from saving money on military spending. The Abraham Accords, though, are more about countries aligning against shared threats, so their economic payoff comes from new trade, tech partnerships, and investment, not from cutting armies. At the end of the day, the lesson here is crystal clear. Peace pays. It just does. But how it pays really depends on the kind of conflict it's fixing, whether it's saving you billions on defense, like in Egypt's case, or unlocking brand new markets. A credible peace treaty is a powerful, powerful economic tool. And all of this leaves us with one last big question to think about. Is peace primarily a moral victory, something we do because it's the right thing to do, or is it a cold, hard economic strategy? Looking at that stunning 82% number from Camp David, the evidence seems to suggest it's profoundly and maybe even inseparably both.